welcome back to Star Trek Sundays, and this week I'm going to pick up where I left off last week by continuing my look at the return of Playmates in the 5-inch action figure scale. Now last week we looked at the Next Generation figures, this week we're going to look at the Wrath of Khan wave. So let's get straight down to business with Captain Kirk. Now if we look at the packaging, of course this will be very familiar to anyone who saw the previous video because it is pretty much the same. The only thing that's different here of course is the image of Captain Kirk and the different Enterprise that we have. Now I really like this packaging design. I said I find it really colourful, I think it's quite exciting, I think it looks really great on display, and I love that they've returned to the illustrated image. I've always loved this on card art and I think this works really well here. So overall I love this packaging. I love the approach they've taken to this and I think it works an absolute treat. Now if I was going to be picking fault, the only criticism I could make of this is that the Enterprise here obviously is from the original series and it's not the Enterprise that we see in the classic Trek movie era. This is a very minor gripe, but nevertheless it did still stick out to me. The reverse of the packaging is identical for all three figures in this wave. In fact, it's the exact same for every single figure in this line. We can see the three different options, the three different waves that have been released as part of this initial lineup. And of course we have that Star Trek Universe logo there. We have that pretty cool QR code, which I think is a pretty nice touch, and then some small prints at the bottom of the packaging. So let's take a gander at the figure outside of the packaging. I have to say, while I was a little bit disappointed with the Next Generation lineup, I do feel that these Wrath of Khan figures are a cut above. The sculpts for the most part are actually pretty good at this scale. Now, I have to admit, Captain Kirk is probably the least successful of the three figures in this wave, but nevertheless, it's actually not a bad likeness for this scale. It is definitely recognisable as being William Shatner's Captain Kirk, so I don't think this is a bad likeness. It's a little bit soft, it's a little bit toyetic, I suppose, in its approach, but it certainly does the job. Now, if we look at the body mold though, this is where things get a lot better and feel a little bit more bespoke to the character, which is great. Each one of these figures has a unique torso sculpt, which is fantastic. And if we look at the Admiral Kirk sculpt here, we can see obviously that he has a slightly bulkier frame when compared to the Captain Spock. Spock is a lot thinner, a lot narrower, as he should be, and this creates a real difference between the two characters and makes them look visually interesting and scalable as they should be in your collection. So this is really good. The other thing is there's actually some other subtle differences as well. If we look closely, we can see that the insignia, the badge at the top of their chest there is very different between the two figures. Admiral Kirk is a lot chunkier and bigger for some reason, whereas Spock's is a lot smaller. Likewise, if we look at the insignia on the lapel, they're denoting rank, we can see there are obvious differences between the symbol there, and that seems to be pretty screen accurate. Also, Kirk has an extra gold paint trim running around the edge of his tunic, which looks really cool, and again I think is pretty screen accurate. So it's nice to see that there's some real differences been put into this to give them their own distinct personality and their own flavour, which is fantastic. The differences don't end there though, because if we look at their sleeves on their arm, we can see that there are individual markings denoting rank as is appropriate for each character. It's little nuances like this that make all the difference. I love this attention to detail and this pays off really well here. One of my criticisms with the Next Generation lineup was that they pretty much recycled the same body sculpts for every single character and it didn't feel quite authentic. This works really well and there's a lot more love and care gone into these figures. Now, the legs for both characters are the same, but I think we can forgive this because the major differences have been accounted for. They do have that wonderful red pinstripe going down the legs, and of course we have those black boots at the bottom there. They're all pretty much one matte paint, but it looks pretty good and it's very serviceable. The articulation scheme is pretty much the same as what we saw with the Next Generation lineup. There is a ball joint in the head which allows the head to move from side to side and wobble left and right. It can nod up and down a little bit as well, which is pretty cool I suppose. There is a ball joint in the shoulder that allows the arm to lift all the way up and out, which is fantastic. Now there's a pin swivel at the elbow as well, so that means that elbow can hinge to about 90 degrees, but it'll also spin the lower arm all the way around as well. Of course, there is a swivel at the wrist as well, so that wrist can rotate all the way around, but sadly there is no hinge, which is a real shame. Now, there's no waist articulation, but the legs do kick out to the side with a ball joint in the hips there. They'll also kick forwards and backwards, and there is another pin swivel, this time at the knee, so this knee will, again, bend the lower leg to about 90 degrees, and it will also rotate around from side to side. Finally, there is a hinge at the ankle that allows the foot to kick forwards and backwards and move from side to side. Each figure does come with some accessories, and as I pointed out last week, most of these accessories are actually the exact same accessories that were released nearly 30 years ago. This time they've just been repackaged, and they don't always work particularly well with these figures. Sakir comes with his phaser, he comes with his data pad, and he also comes with his wrist communicator. These are all pretty cool accessories, they're pretty authentic to what we see in the Wrath of Khan, which is pretty nice to note, but you may notice that the scaling is ever so slightly off. Things are absolutely fine when Kirk is holding his data pad there, but it doesn't look quite right so much when he's holding his phaser and his wrist communicator. Now, I think the phaser just about works, to be fair, but this wrist communicator is clearly not to scale because this is far chunkier than what we see in the film and virtually takes up his whole arm. Also, it's really disappointing that they've made no effort whatsoever when it comes to the paint apps on these accessories. They are just, of course, moulded in that base grey plastic, and that's it. Okay, so moving on to Captain Spock. Clearly, we already know what to expect from the packaging. Again, I have to say, I really love this. I love how it displays. It's just so colourful and bright. And the image here, the illustrated image of Spock here, is just wonderful. I think they've done a really nice job capturing the likeness of Leonard Nimoy for this packaging. So if we take a look at the figure himself, I have to say again, I'm actually quite impressed with the figure at this scale. I think they've done a really nice job of this. If we look at the likeness, again, it's a little bit soft of course, but I think this is actually pretty successful in the main. This is definitely recognisable as Spock, and I think they've caught his likeness just right. Now, we've already seen some of the key differences between this figure and Admiral Kirk, so I'm not going to go over that anymore. The only thing I did want to point out is that they do give Spock his Vulcan salute, which I think is a really nice touch and works really well. Now, in terms of his accessories, he actually comes with some interesting choices here. He actually has the two gloves that we see at the end of the film when he's in the containment room, which I think is a pretty cool choice. He also comes with what I think is his tricorder, and he has this piece, which I actually think is from the original series. I don't think we actually see this in the movies, although I could be wrong. In any case, he has no problems holding this in his free hand, and actually this scales quite nicely, so this actually works. Now, at first glance, you could be forgiven for thinking that the gloves are actually separate hands that just pop on and off, but they don't. They're actually operating gloves that actually slide over the existing hands. So if you split them apart and slide them over the hands, you can get them over. Now, you will notice that one of them has that pointing finger, which does look a little bit silly, and it reminds me very much of the kind of thing that you get going to a football match. But having said that, I have to say, against all my expectations, they work quite well. Now, I thought they'd be horrifically out of scale and look really, really daft and silly, as this approach often has been in the past, but here it actually works surprisingly well, and I think the overall effect is very good. And now we move our attention at last to Khan, the villain of the piece. And so far he is the only antagonist that has been released in any of the 3 waves that we've seen so far from Playmates. So this gives him a special place in the collection. And just like the other figures in this series, I absolutely love this card art. And this figure is pretty refreshing. As I said, he's the only non-Starfleet character in the entire lineup so far, so he has a completely unique and individual look and body sculpt. And the head sculpt, I have to say, is probably the best of the entire line so far. I think this is a really good likeness. There's actually a lot of detail, a lot of lines in the face and in the hair there, and a number of different paint apps to really bring out some of those details. So I think this works really surprisingly well at this scale. And this remains true for the rest of the sculpt. It is littered with detail and individual bits and pieces which make it really interesting to look at, and they are all fantastically capitalised on by the wonderful paint apps as well, just giving that little bit of texture, a little bit of dirt and worn quality to them, which looks really good, very screen accurate actually, and I think they've done a very nice job of plucking out these details and bringing them to life, and they don't seem to have spared any expense here at all. They've really captured the essence of the character, so I'm very, very impressed with what they've done with this figure, and I'd probably say he's my favourite of all of them. I'm not going to go on about the articulation because it is the same as all the other figures in this line, but I did want to point out that his head movements are restricted by that solid, thick plastic hair piece there, so you're not going to get quite as much of a range of motion as you will with the other figures in this line. Now, Playmates did release a pretty cool Khan figure way back when in the 90s, and they have replicated the exact same accessories for this version of Khan, but I think they're actually pretty successful here. So he comes with the Genesis device, which is a pretty cool piece to have. Again, shame there's no paint apps on this, but nevertheless, a cool accessory to have. Of course, he also has his bowl of SETI eels as well, and a phaser. And not forgetting his tweezers for picking out the eels. Now, for the most part, these accessories work a lot better. They seem to work with the scale a little bit more. Admittedly, these tweezers still seem a little bit large, and the bowl doesn't really fit in his hand. I'm really relying on gravity there to hold it into place because he cannot grip it or hold it particularly, but hey, if you persevere, you can get the effect, and I still think this looks pretty good. Now, although Khan never actually uses or fires a phaser in the film, it is nice that he comes with one. For some reason, it just feels natural that Khan should have a phaser. And so there you have it, there's my whistle-stop tour looking at the 3 Wrath of Khan figures that have been released so far as part of Playmates Return to the 5-inch scale. I have to say, I really like these figures. These are much more my speed than the next generation figures, which I found to be disappointing overall. Here, they've definitely addressed some of the issues that I was concerned about there. They all feel unique and individual, which is fantastic, and although the accessories don't really quite work in a lot of the cases because of the scale is off, they are nice touches, and I think you can forgive them because they are, of course, at a much smaller scale and at a much lower price point. I do actually really hope they continue with this line in particular. I think this wave has been really fun, and I would like to see other movie era characters added to this roster. Of course, the rest of the crew, but also some of the other villains like Krug and General Chang would be fantastic additions to this line. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.